Well, thank you so much, John, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to the Paideia Institute for having me. I love the kind of work that you all do, and I'm happy to play a small role in it here. So the title of my talk today is going to be What Thinking Looks Like, Raphael's School of Athens as a Guide to Teaching and Learning. I got really interested in this question of what does thinking look like? Admittedly, a kind of peculiar question, but there are at least two things I think that sparked my interest in it. First has to do with the book that John was just mentioning, Rome as a Guide to the Good Life, which I've been working on over the past few years. And it's my attempt to kind of think philosophically about Rome. We sometimes think of thinking and philosophy as a kind of disembodied activity, or at least an activity that is sort of indifferent to its place. But I was interested in the idea of, well, what would a kind of more embodied practice of thinking look like? And could we use Rome, for instance, as a space of philosophical thinking? And I do think that at times there are spaces that sort of naturally incline us to philosophy. Like John was just mentioning, the Protestant cemetery, and in a way, all cemeteries, I think, incline people to musing about life and death. Or the Colosseum perhaps inclines us to certain kinds of philosophical questions. And maybe travel itself is one of the most profound things that can open up questions about who we are and the kind of people we want to be. But I got interested then in, so not just the place of thinking, but what about the actual embodied place of thinking? Among other things, Rome is a wonderful place for portraying philosophers, sculptures and paintings of philosophers. Maybe Rome commemorates philosophers like no other city in the world. So I got interested in the idea of just the look of philosophy and the look of thinking more generally. The second thing that sparked my interest was, while at the same time I was starting to work on the book, COVID hit, and I was forced to transfer all my classes to Zoom. And so I had to teach under lockdown. And I had the sort of opposite question occur to me, or the complementary question occur to me. What does thinking not look like? I found myself looking at kind of the Brady Bunch squares on my screen of students in various phases of disengagement. Students sometimes even flat out sleeping or being quite distracted. And so I felt a kind of yearning for the look of thinking again, and what active, engaged thinking actually is. And of course, like everyone, I've been struck by the phenomenon of the rise of smartphones, where almost everyone is staring at their smartphones all the time. And that too struck me as a kind of look of not thinking, or at least not quite thinking. My dear friend Scott Newstock introduced me to this photographic series by the photographer Eric Pickersgill called Removed, where he takes pictures of people, and of course they're almost all on their phones, and then he photographically removes the phone, so we're just left with the people and their stare, which often comes across to me as a kind of almost self-zombification. Maybe at times a little self-zombification is okay, but it seems to me not the ideal for a human life, where people are sort of there but not really present. And it seems to me that the look that I see over and over again in this situation and in photographs like this is where attention becomes a kind of just passive resource to be mined rather than an activity. So I come back to that question, and so what is the physical appearance of thoughtfulness? But I guess the maybe more profound question has to do with, what does the look of thinking tell us about thinking itself, and also about education? When we first think about the look of thinking, we have a tendency to fall back onto cliches. I take it these are the two most common cliches to portray the look of thinking, the kind of, chin scratch and looking up, and then of course the aha moment where the light bulb dawns on a person. There's obviously a grain of truth in these depictions of thinking, though I also think that they're somewhat misleading. They sort of show thinking, again, to be a rather passive thing, that you sort of just, enter into some inward bubbling thoughts and then wait around long enough, and eventually some idea sort of just occurs to us. And I think of this as a practical matter. As a teacher, I sometimes will emphasize to my students, if they're, say, writing a paper, that I want them to actually do some thinking. And I wonder if sometimes this is what occurs to them. They just think, well, is he asking me to kind of just stand around doing nothing until an idea, pops on in my head? So I want us to find some better ways of conceptualizing what it means to actually be thinking. And of course, what's the more iconic depiction of thinking than Raphael's School of Athens, which happens to be in Rome, well, technically in Vatican City, in the Vatican, painted around 1509 to 1511. It is surely the most iconic image of philosophy. Whenever a philosopher writes for the popular press, you can bet on an image being drawn from this work to illustrate it, usually of the central figures there, Plato and Aristotle. But like I guess all iconic paintings, it's one of those odd things that it becomes almost invisible to us. We don't really look at it. We just sort of register it as, oh, deep thinking, or maybe classical deep thinking. And so I wanted to sort of just dive into it and really look at it, both through the lens of how art historians have looked at it, but also somewhat innocently, just sort of looking at the painting and asking what it has to teach us. Raphael is drawing on a tradition of depicting thinking that I think is probably a little better than ours, but it's still not really very dynamic. The early Renaissance, had images of the Sacra Conversazione, the sacred conversation, essentially showing theologians and saints standing around contemplating the Virgin and Child. Here are two really marvelous paintings, one by Fra Angelico and one by Piero della Francesca, one of my favorite painters. And I think these are quite profound in their way and certainly very beautiful, but they're still give the sense of thought as being a very deeply inward kind of thing, very subtly portrayed on the face. And it seems like Raphael was interested in sort of turning up the depiction of thinking a bit. I've also grown convinced that Raphael may be drawing on Filippino Lippi's Carafa Chapel in Santa Maria sopra Minerva, which is not far from the Vatican, and it was painted roughly 20 years before Raphael's School of Athens. It's a really marvelous painting in its own way. It depicts at the very center the philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas, and he is kind of triumphing over a set of heretics. He's stomping with his foot on a kind of an embodiment of sin or heresy. And then, beneath him, we have various other figures who have sort of dropped their heretical books and have been shamed by the truth. The figure that Thomas is stomping on may be a attempt to portray someone like Averroes, the Arabic philosopher, and he's holding a little sign there that says sapientia vincit malitiam, wisdom conquers wickedness. And I take it that this is an image that in a way expresses the dream of all ideologues, that your truth will one day become so clear that all your ideological opponents sort of drop their vicious and wicked books in shame and hang their heads in the majesty of your doctrine. And it was painted at a time when the Dominicans, I guess, were particularly concerned about heretical beliefs growing up. So this is kind of trying to reinforce this idea of correct doctrine. but in any case, it's hard for me not to believe that there was some kind of interesting inspiration going on here between Raphael and Filippino Lippi's painting. Compositionally, they're quite similar. You have in Lippi's painting one philosopher at the center of it, and then a set of other thinkers lower down to the left and right. In Raphael's, you have two philosophers, but then also a set of thinkers to the left and right. You have the kind of fictive architecture, fictive Roman architecture that Raphael is again trying to one up maybe a bit, and then this sort of proscenium framing the whole thing. But it's almost to me as if Raphael was like, well, what if instead of ideological triumph, people actually picked up the books and started reading them and interacting and conversing with each other. So it portrays to me a very different spirit overall with regard to intellectual engagement. Raffaello Sanzio d'Urbino, known to us as Raphael, 1483 to 1520. Of course, as you know, one of the principal artists of the High Renaissance, along with figures like Michelangelo, Bramante, and Leonardo, all of whom Raphael, I think, learned from in certain ways, which I think is important. Ingrid Rowland, the really humane and wonderful historian, conjectures that the idea for the School of Athens may have been conceived in the Sistine Chapel on January 1st, 1508. This would have been right before Michelangelo begins to paint its ceiling. Battista Casali gave a lecture there at that time, arguing that the best weapon against the Ottoman Turks was not any armament or piece of propaganda, but rather the books of the Vatican Library, particularly the wonders of Greek, Latin, and Arabic philosophy. It is interesting that in Raphael's School of Athens, he portrays a figure in the garb of the Ottoman Turks as part of the conversation itself, and some people argue this is Averroes. If so, it's an interesting transformation of Averroes being stomped on by Thomas Aquinas to Averroes as a kind of active participant in the School of Athens. In any case, shortly after the lecture, Raphael is commissioned by Pope Julius II to design and paint various rooms, including the room containing the Vatican's library. And this is the room that comes to be known as the Stanza della Segnatura, the room of the signature, presumably because the Pope would sign documents there. And originally, there would have been a library here, though that's long since moved on. Some of you have surely been there, so you understand the kind of majesty of the place. Hopefully, this picture gives at least a rough sense of it. Everything about it is a work of art, from floors to the ceilings to every other part. There are other great frescoes that Raphael and his team do. We see Parnassus here, as well as the Disputa, the Disputation, the work of theology. Of course, the School of Athens, and you get a sense of the size too. You have the door here, quite an actually large door, and so you get a sense that these figures are actually larger than life size that we're looking at. And again, just this may be common knowledge, but it's important to point out that Raphael's not just a kind of singular genius here. He is a singular genius, but he's working with guidance from intellectual advisors, some of whom are his close friends, Renaissance humanists. And he's also working with a team of painters, a workshop that he runs. So not only is he a kind of genius unto himself, he's also a sort of genius of collaboration. I always think of, in the 20th century, of the figure probably most like Raphael as being Duke Ellington. So when you read the art history scholarship on this, a whole lot of it is devoted to a game of kind of who's who, guessing which figures are which. It's also curious, it seems like The Italians have one set of guesses, the Germans have a different set of guesses, the Americans have their sets of guesses. And some of it is interesting and important. A lot of it I find a little tedious after a while, about is this Archytas or is this Antisthenes, or I'm not always so sure that a lot hangs on some of it, though some of it does. And like I said, that is one way of going at it. And I do think that Raphael himself intended some of this guessing game to be going on. One thing that he inherited, or at least was aware of, was the idea of painting sort of exemplary figures and then giving a name to them, actually writing the name underneath them. Well, it seems like Raphael is interested in flexing his muscles a bit here and saying, well, I can show these figures where you don't even need the name, where you can guess which is which. But I also wonder if Renaissance artists aren't interested in kind of stimulating educated guesswork beyond, even what's crystal clear, just to kind of keep the mind going 500 years later or so. The unmistakable figures, the ones that no one has ever guessed to be anything but who they are at the center. Plato and Aristotle. Plato is identifiable because he's holding a folio of the Timaeus, and next to him is Aristotle holding a folio of the Nicomachean Ethics. Scholars also argue a bit about what these two guys are doing here. Are they disagreeing, or are they hammering out some kind of synthesis? The century prior to Raphael, there definitely was serious competition going on between Platonism and Aristotelianism. And we sometimes think of the Renaissance as a kind of rebirth of Platonism, but actually some of the figures that were probably crucial to the shaping of the School of Athens, including people like Pico della Mirandola, actually were trying to argue that Plato and Aristotle could be reconciled in some sense, and some of them even arguing that the Timaeus and the Ethics represent kind of complementary things. In any case, I'm not super interested in that debate for our purposes today. I do want to come back to them, but this is, of course, the most iconic image of all. Maybe another part of the fun, or at least the insider part of the fun for Raphael, was recognizing contemporaries in some of the School of Athens. Plato, for instance, is maybe Leonardo da Vinci. If he's not directly based on Leonardo da Vinci, he's based on a drawing that Leonardo did. Some people take it to be a self-portrait, others take it to be a drawing of imagining what Plato looked like in old age. In any case, Raphael seems clearly to be drawing on Leonardo's work here. And I think that this is another kind of interesting thing that we'll see a few times here, is that we have the School of Athens, but we also in some sense have the School of Raphael, or the school where Raphael learned. He sort of figures some of his education into the painting itself. Leonardo was crucial for Raphael to learn the linear perspective that is on display in the School of Athens. And there's a kind of maybe hat tip to Leonardo here in the figure of Plato, who also had, both Plato and Leonardo had a kind of knack for penetrating to the forms of things. The painting is divided into two halves. The left side, Plato's half, depicts mostly, we could say, more intuitive, abstract thinkers. They are on Aristotle and Plato's right, and it's interesting that we might describe them as more right-brained kind of thinkers that seem to be concerned with transcendent ideas and principles, presided over by a statue of Apollo. The other side, our right half, Aristotle's side, depicts more kind of precise, evidence-based type thinkers, so to speak, left-brain type thinkers, concerned with empirical, down-to-earth type matters, presided over by a statue of Minerva. We see here a figure coming up the steps. Some people have suggested that demonstrates that one ascends from mathematics, which is going on in the lower part, which we'll get to in a second, to higher forms of science and understanding. maybe, but I definitely do think that we see here a progression, which I want to come back to, and the idea that the education is leading to something. There are all sorts of just marvelous scenes when we start to dig into the School of Athens, of depicting thinking in its more active sense. This is one of my favorite little ones from Aristotle's side, where you have a young person who's seemingly in the grip of some kind of inspiration, who wants to jot it down, doesn't have a table available, and so leans against the wall and makes a makeshift table with the crossed legs to get the idea down. And then the kind of casual older figure above overlooking what's going on, kind of, what you writing there, kid? On the steps, the figure is generally identified as Diogenes. Diogenes, the ancient philosopher who was famously disdainful of social conventions. Here he is reading on the steps like the whole world is his personal sofa. But here too, I think we have kind of an interesting image of thinking. It occurs to me that we can contrast it with that idea of mind attention that's going on sometimes with the smartphone. It seems that we have a different kind of attentiveness here, a more active attentiveness, that suggests to me that maybe reading can be mere distraction, but that there is a kind of reading that involves a different way of engaging imaginatively with what's being read, and that can, in some sense, even be seen on the face and its concentration. The kind of counterpart to Diogenes on Plato's side is usually identified as Heraclitus, but this seems to be modeled on Michelangelo, another, so to speak, teacher of Raphael, not in the sense of being a direct pupil of Michelangelo's, but Raphael certainly looking at what Michelangelo is doing and taking inspiration from it. In the Renaissance in particular, there is this kind of idea that there were two type philosophers, Democritus, who was always laughing, and Heraclitus, who was always weeping, perhaps because he recognizes that the world is in constant flux and everything is kind of a constant loss. Montaigne has a nice essay contrasting them. But Michelangelo himself was known to have a kind of melancholic temperament. And so we see that being depicted here. You know, I'm curious here as I'm thinking about what thinking looks like. One of the kind of things that I've noticed is that thinking is often depicted, or we often see people thinking with crossed legs. There's a wonderful art historian, Leo Steinberg, who talks about Michelangelo's portrayal of Jeremiah in the Sistine Chapel being done almost simultaneously with the School of Athens, where he describes Michelangelo's Jeremiah as being expressive of the energy of deep thought. And so we see this kind of entering into melancholy, going deep within oneself. And we see a similar poses here. Again, makes me sometimes wonder if Raphael was alluding to what Michelangelo is doing just down the hall. But now we come to, I think, some more interesting, or at least richer imagery about teaching and learning. I find this to be one of Raphael's most miraculous inventions in the School of Athens. Presumably a portrayal of Euclid instructing students in geometry with the chalkboard here on the floor. This is, to me, just an absolutely miraculous attempt of an artist to try to depict thinking and education. Euclid, interestingly, is almost surely modeled on the architect Bramante, another figure that Raphael was learning a whole lot from. So here we have a picture on the left of Bramante, and then, of course, the Euclid in the School of Athens. Among other things, Raphael was in all likelihood using some of Bramante's burgeoning plans for St. Peter's Basilica as kind of inspiration as he's thinking through the fictive architecture that becomes the place of the School of Athens. I should just say as a side note here, I don't believe that this fresco was named the School of Athens until I think the 1700s, till the 18th century at some point. So that's a kind of made up name. Of course, I do think it's correct to say that there's a very strong school-like atmosphere. And of course, many of the philosophers are Greek philosophers, hence the name, the School of Athens. But in many ways, this is the School of Rome or the School of Bramante. It's probably based on the kind of architecture that Raphael saw in ruins, but then also the kind of reimagining, the Renaissance reimagining of it that would become places like St. Peter's Basilica. But if we go back to this really miraculous imagery of Euclid instructing students, what we see here is a very fine-grained, to me, portrayal of the unfolding of thinking itself. So first of all, we have Euclid curiously bent over in a way resembling the compass that he's using to make his demonstration on the chalkboard on the floor. And right above him, we have a student who is focusing on whatever's going on the chalkboard, struggling to kind of understand it. Right above that student, we have someone with an expression of dawning understanding, a kind of, am I getting this right? Pointing down at what's going on. And this student is looking up at the next student above him, who seems to be kind of buoyed up by his comprehension of what's going on. Aha, yes, I do see what's happening. And then we have the final student to our left, who seems to already understand the proof and is anticipating the next move of it. So that we see a kind of electric circuit of education itself, from teacher through the stages of student understanding. And that Raphael has portrayed this and arranged the students in such a way that they form a kind of compositional circle with the student of dawning understanding at the very center. So this seems to me to be a very profound image of a certain kind of education. On Euclid's tablet, we have some kind of proof going on, presumably a proof of a theorem. Again, there's a certain amount of debate about what exactly this is about. It may be what gets come to be called Fichtner's theorem, pertaining to a diagonal and a chord within a Star of David. But in all likelihood, Raphael was himself learning a certain amount of the relationship between geometry and architecture from Bramante. And it may well be that some of what's being demonstrated here is what is going into the organization of the School of Athens itself. So we're seeing the kind of geometry at the basis of the School of Athens being demonstrated. We see that when we look around the School of Athens, we find other very interesting images of teachers instructing students. If we jump up to Plato's side, right to the left of Plato, to Plato's right, we see the unmistakable image of Socrates instructing a set of students. Raphael was drawing on various ancient busts of Socrates and his famous ugliness with the snub nose and protruding eyes that Plato remarks upon several times in the dialogue itself. I find that we see here a very different model of teaching. If we look at the Euclid example, we have a very kind of self-contained form of education, a demonstration that is precise, and things seem to be rather centripetal, that there seem to be kind of going inward to the precise point of understanding. Whereas when we look at Socrates here, he seems to be engaged in lecturing of a kind. He's counting off points on his fingers in the way teachers will sometimes do. There seems to be a more abstract quality to whatever he's doing, and the idea seems to be, my way of putting it, is more centrifugal. We see one figure looking off in one direction and another figure looking off in the opposite direction, and then people of different levels of engagement with Socrates himself. I have to say, as someone who's taught a lot at a community college, I resonate deeply with this image of Socrates teaching his students, in that we have kind of multi-generations, different levels of engagement with what's going on. The one thing I have learned is that the student next to Socrates, who seems to be looking off, spacily dreaming, sometimes such students are more engaged than you might believe at first. I do think that Raphael is interested in creating contrast throughout this work, and I'm not quite sure, to be quite honest with you, what the contrast here is with Socrates and his teaching, but maybe it's what's in the other corner, where we see some astronomers and geographers who seem to be in something of a conversation themselves. In any case, I do think that there's, Raphael's a kind of master of the dynamic balance. And so I do think there are a set of balances, as I've tried to draw here. We have things like, Diogenes and Heraclitus seem to be balancing each other. Of course, at the center, Plato and Aristotle. As we'll get to in a second, I think Pythagoras is meant to balance out Euclid over here. So two different forms of mathematical engagement. We have over in the far corner here, Epicurus. I'm unfortunately not going to say much about him, but he's kind of an interesting character here. And so we have two writers going on in this regard. And I wonder if we don't have Socrates' kind of engagement here, the sort of horizontal engagement, is balancing out what's going on over here. In any case, what is going on over there is in part a self-portrait of Raphael. Raphael paints himself, presumably as the ancient Greek painter Apelles, in conversation with a group of astronomers and geographers, perhaps to suggest that art itself is a search for truth on par with the observational sciences. We'll come back to this little group, but one thing that we might note right now is that the character right next to Raphael is also a source of a lot of guesswork. I'm kind of fond of the guess that this might be Raphael's actual teacher, Perugino, being portrayed as Protogenes, the kind of counterpart to Apelles, rivals and collaborators in ancient Greece. So, there's at least maybe some resemblance between Perugino's self-portrait and this here, though other people suggest that this may be the figure next to Raphael, may be some member of his workshop, including someone like maybe Il Sodoma. But now let's jump over to what I think of as the counterpart to Euclid, the portrayal of who is almost certainly Pythagoras. This is a really, I think, mysterious image, and it took me a while of looking at it before I felt like I started to get something of a handle on it. There are different levels of mystery. First of all, we have just the mystery of what's going on around Pythagoras. We also have this very mysterious figure above them who happens to be looking out at us in the same way that Raphael is looking out at us from the painting. It seems as if everyone in the School of Athens is male, though curiously, sometimes my students wonder if some of them aren't female, just given their long hair and flowy clothes, though I think that may be a misreading on their part. But there is serious debate about if this figure is a woman, perhaps meant to be Hypatia, the 4th century Alexandrian mathematician and philosopher. That's a kind of an attractive reading, though other people suggest other possibilities, including Francesco Maria della Rovere, Julius II's kind of nice-looking nephew who ends up getting involved in all sorts of intrigues. I don't know why Raphael would portray that person there, but that is a speculation. Some, I think, speculate more reasonably that maybe this is Pico della Mirandola, the great Renaissance philosopher who did seem to have a strong influence on the painting and hence might be looking out at us from the painting. Or maybe this is a figure of truth that is looking out at us as well. But I'm interested more in this profound contrast between these two forms of teaching. So we've talked about Euclid and the kind of student-centered, in Raphael's way of portraying it, literally the student is in the center of the composition. The dawning understanding is what's fundamental, and a kind of crystalline demonstration that's going on all for the purpose of that circuit of understanding. And then when we look over at Pythagoras, a very different conception, one we might call teacher-centered, where Pythagoras is in the very center of something like a circle of figures who are looking around him, trying to see what he's working on, or perhaps trying to see the tablet that's being held up by this other figure as if in a game of almost keep away that's going on. So we're seeing a kind of strange mystery. As I looked at this, what really dawned on me was my own kind of education and how important what Raphael is portraying in this has been to me in my education. While I have definitely benefited from teachers who have tried to walk me carefully through the stages of understanding, I've been perhaps just as I've learned just as much, if not more, from teachers who in some sense were rather indifferent to me as a student, but who were so deeply engaged in their own work that I found it deeply inspiring, and you know, sort of had to stretch out to try to understand what was going on for myself. I've already mentioned that this may be Averroes, the figure in the kind of garb of the Ottoman Turks. We have this other really wonderful older figure who's bending over, trying to get, you know, the notes, so to speak, in a way that reminds me of when my students show up and have missed the previous class and kind of leaning over, trying to get their neighbors' notes. But we see here, you know, Pythagoras, the ancient philosopher, was known for a kind of cultivated mystery. And it does seem quite appropriate that Raphael utilizes him here to portray what I think is another very powerful mode of education. What's on the tablet that is being held up, or sort of the game of keep away is being played with, is this, which in all likelihood is an attempt to express the mathematics for the music of the spheres that Renaissance philosophers were interested in, and looking back to Pythagoreanism as the source of it. So I'm happy to kind of, this contains the whole meaning of the entire universe on it, and I'll be happy to explain it to you, but maybe we'll wait till after the question and answer period to unlock its mysteries. But suffice to say, this will teach you what the universe is all about. Okay, so now we go back to Plato and Aristotle, and you know, maybe this is a kind of obvious point, but it didn't dawn on me for quite some time that this is a painting of a teacher and a student. Of course, Aristotle is perhaps the most famous student in the history of Western philosophy, the student of Plato. And we see here a generational difference that suggests that a teacher and a student. But obviously, this is not a portrayal of Plato teaching Aristotle or Aristotle teaching Plato. So maybe we could think of this as an image of the goal of teaching and learning. We have all of these kinds of educational activities organized around a conversation between the teacher and the student, where the goal seems to be that the teacher and the student have become equals and are able to converse with each other, perhaps disagree, or perhaps hammer out a higher synthesis, but a kind of fully actualized model of what education can ultimately attain. And I wonder if this isn't something like what Raphael himself was thinking about as he's painting this, as he himself becomes the kind of equal to his teachers, able to converse, so to speak, with them. So just a few really rough conclusions, and then maybe we can have some questions and answers. And I think there's a lot of things that one could draw from this, but a few things that I just have felt very powerfully in thinking about it is that though we see truth being fundamental here, part of the beauty of this painting is showing how truth seeking, at least for us humans, is more fundamental than any doctrine of the truth, that the focal point of the painting is not the purveyor of a correct doctrine, but rather the kind of point of conversation between fully empowered thinkers. And it also seems to be worth pointing out that what Raphael seems to be portraying here is that truth-seeking requires different aptitudes and different approaches. One of the things that I find irritating about a lot of kind of contemporary pedagogues is their attempt to try to always reduce something to a single methodology and dismiss things like lecturing or whatever, which our experience sort of shows to be incorrect. And what Raphael seems to be doing here as a good kind of empirical thinker is to show us the mind well at work in its varieties, and that's irreducible to any single methodology or pedagogy. To go back to kind of my original question of what thinking looks like, it does occur to me that thinking is not merely a passive or even a completely inward event, even if it has that inward mystery to it. It's very much an embodied activity that activates the face and the hands, among other things. And we see a kind of tremendous activity going on here that makes this painting so attractive. I'd also want to argue that education is being shown here as a kind of end in itself, and that a good school, if this is a school, models a kind of ideal city, an ideal Rome, where people have been liberated in some sense from factions and the rancor that often characterizes political and social life, and been given a kind of gift of an interval, to use Michael Oakeshott's very nice phrase for it, a kind of ideal city that transcends the power plays that go on everywhere else. And as I mentioned, that this painting may have been generated in part by a kind of speech contrasting the real treasures of wisdom with the kinds of things that are often seen as powerful in war. And it seems like there's no question, 500 years later, was the investment in the war machine more worth it, or was the investment in art and culture of the Renaissance more worth it? That art and culture is won out. As I've just mentioned, the goal here seems to be a kind of equality or empowered conversation, similar to how Raphael has become capable of conversing artistically with figures like Perugino, Leonardo, Bramante, Michelangelo, as well as conversing intellectually with figures like Pico della Mirandola or Tommaso Inghirami. I'll end with just going back to Raphael and his portraying of himself in the School of Athens. I became very interested in just sort of staring at Raphael as he was staring at me and wondering, what is he saying to me, or what is he thinking? And this is what I kind of came up with. He seems to be looking out at us saying, I'm inside this painting. I'm here in this conversation. Of course, I'm also outside this painting. I painted it. So we have Plato pointing up and Aristotle sort of motioning down. He's looking out. We're looking in. Isn't humanity also to be in and out of art in this regard, in and out of philosophy, in and out of all human things? Doesn't our humanity dwell in the back and forth of this kind of conversation? Doesn't our individuality even lie in the in-between where this kind of interaction happens? And so maybe the last point I would want to make is to me, the School of Athens invites us to, so to speak, be the conversation, that it doesn't seem enough just to know about its contents, to be able to guess who's who, for instance. So I'll end with this quotation of Seneca that I think nicely states a point similar to what I'm trying to make here, where he says, the only people really at leisure are those who take time for philosophy. They alone really live. They are careful stewards of not just their lifetime. They annex every age to their own and make use of all the years that have gone before. Unless we prove ungrateful, it was for us that the illustrious founders of divine schools of thought came into being. For us, they prepared a way of life. Okay, well, like I said, I can still tell you the whole meaning of the universe, but maybe we should have some questions first. John, if you're talking, I can't hear you, I believe.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I gave people the ability to unmute themselves now.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, I clicked the unmute button. But so I just was saying we normally have some time for questions, but we like to get people out at the hour mark if they have someplace to go. So what we'll do is we will I guess we'll take a first question. You can raise your hand, and I'll call on people kind of in the order that they come up, and then at the hour mark we can if those who want to go, they can do so. Scott has promised us the meaning of life might be revealed in the question and answer session, so you might want to linger a little bit longer for that. But anyway, it looks like Jason, you're up first.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a wonderful lecture, very nice intervention on a Friday afternoon. My question is about the figure that Euclid is drawing and the idea that it might be a Star of David, or that it is a Star of David, but also might mirror the architectural plan of the School of Athens itself. And I made the connection, Athens and Jerusalem, right? So I mean, the inhabitants are the inhabitants of this city of Athens, but the architecture is the Star of David. So there's not a lot of Christianity in that picture, but then again, it's in the Vatican, which is the very architecture of the carrying forward of that whole tradition. So I was curious if you'd ever heard that interpretation before, or what you thought of it.
Well, I haven't, though it certainly seems plausible. I mean, Raphael and the kind of thinkers he's working with were interested in these kinds of grand syntheses of where all these things kind of come together. And I do think that there is some speculation that there may be a portrayal of Maimonides in the School of Athens, though I don't think that that's well established by any means. Like I said, you may have an Arabic philosopher, so it'd be interesting to have the Star of David as well. And of course, right across from it, you have right across from the School of Athens, you have a portrayal of Christian theology. So there is that kind of synthesis going on in the room itself, and maybe there is a little glimpse of it reflected there. I'm still trying to myself sort out exactly the exact qualities of that Star of David. But another thing just to say is that circles seem to play an important role in what Raphael's doing, but triangles may be even more important. There's just all sorts of triangular figures throughout the painting, and so one wonders if he wasn't using some of that geometry, not just to structure the whole thing, but even locally on various figures. But I definitely like the Jerusalem and Athens thing. That has a real charm to it.
Scott, do you often teach from images like this and kind of like try to unpack a painting? Because I had a teacher once said that all transformation, like spiritual transformation, occurs in the presence of images. He thought that the images were the most important thing, and that like seeing School of Athens does more for your philosophical approach than talking about principles. And it seems that you have a certain similarity in the way you teach.
Well, I've been trying to do more of that. I mean, this is part of what has been exciting to me about teaching in Rome originally, was just really immersing myself in that art and wanting to kind of engage with it and thoughtfully. And so I've been trying to work up that kind of stuff more. I do think that, I mean, there's certainly something true with that looking at these images deeply impresses itself on the mind in ways that often go beyond just reading about things or talking about things, or at least doing those things in tandem with each other becomes more powerful than any by itself alone. I have been with the School of Athens sometimes starting off classes by having students look at it and think about it in a way just to reflect on their own active engagement with thinking. You know, what kinds of things do they see that their own thinking reflected in the School of Athens, and what might they take away from it as part of what it means to be more actively engaged students and engaged in philosophical thought.
Are there other questions? Mark?
Not so much a question. I just wanted to thank you, Scott, and just say that delightful talk, and it filled me like I was very moved by seeing that painting. It's one I've loved for many years. But I'm a retired high school teacher, and I remember we used to have these workshops where there was a program. We were to make thinking visible to our students. And I regret now that I didn't have this talk. I could have been made more use of the painting. Anyway, thank you, and I thank you for the talk, and I look forward to reading your new book.
Well, thank you so much for that.
I mean, so I know your next book project is more like a cookbook, right?
That's what I'm working on right now. It's in Dante refers to philosophy oftentimes as the bread of angels. And I thought, well, I've always loved cooking and eating, and I've been trying to think a little bit more philosophically about it. And I thought about what about reversing his expression to be the angels of bread. So that's you know, you know, with the Rome book, I got interested in the idea of what does it mean to think philosophically as a traveler. And so I'm interested in this idea of kind of taking philosophy a little bit outside the academic classroom. And so it seems to me worthwhile to look at the bread of angels again. So that's maybe my next project, or that's what I've been working on at least.
Have you thought about doing more stuff interpreting paintings?
I would love to. I really I mean, it's just one of my favorite activities in life is just sort of diving into paintings. And as I mentioned, I think at the beginning, I'm lucky enough to be married to an art historian who can sometimes help me and guide me in the right direction when I get a little lost. But yeah, no, I really love doing that. And I do have this other idea for a project that it would actually be called What Thinking Looks Like, that tries to examine how artists have portrayed thinkers and thinking, which seems like an interesting challenge, I think, to the artist to portray what is seemingly such an inward activity. And yet I think that there's often quite perceptive things that artists come across. So, you know, I've played that out a little bit here with regard to the School of Athens, but I'd be very interested in looking at it in a whole set of other figures as well.
Mark, you got to follow up?
Yeah, this is kind of the impossible question, but given where you're coming from, I'm curious if you if you have any tricks up your sleeve. I like the idea of being the conversation. How do you do that as a teacher, or how do you invite your students towards that goal? I mean, that's a really big question, but I would love it. Anything that pops into your head, I'd be very grateful for that.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure we all have our tricks, but I mean, I'll frame my answer, I guess, in terms of the School of Athens itself, I mean, if I think about Pythagoras, I do think of how important that is, that I myself always have to be really activated and alive by whatever it is that I'm teaching. And that itself often is inspiring and inviting to students. But I guess I also try to keep a little bit of the other side of Euclid in me as well, of remembering sometimes that I need to go back and start at the beginning and walk people through those stages of understanding. But and also just always, I don't know. I mean, I guess my simplest answer is that to invite my students to be the conversation, that I have to be the conversation myself, that I have to embody that in some ways, in ways that when I think about my own teachers, the ones who moved me the most, I remember having this profound feeling of as if I'd come out of a stale room into clear, fresh mountain air. That the whole environment seemed to change around me when I was in the presence of that kind of education. And so, it's important to try to keep that alive within oneself, such that environment welcomes others into it. And obviously, sometimes people are just not as ready to enter into that as others. But I do find that most people come alive to it, when you find the right little ways into it yourself.
If there are no other questions, I want to make one more comment, which I don't think it's not a question, and I may just be rephrasing something that you said, but I found it really profound. So I just want to say it out loud again to see if other people thought that too. So, I mean, the interpretation of Plato and Aristotle, what they're doing, the sort of cheap, quick one is, oh, well, Plato's pointing up because he's an idealist, and Aristotle's pointing down because he's a realist, right? But he's not actually pointing down. He's kind of like got his hand out like this, which always puzzled me, and I never felt like I had a good explanation for it. But your talk has really hammered home that actually what we've got are two. We've got a vertical and a horizontal plane, right? And the vertical is the plane of the ideals, and the horizontal is the plane of sort of like communication and realia, which is the plane that we're all operating on. And of course, that works beautifully in this case because you've got a painting that you're looking at, right, as a viewer. So the horizontal plane that Aristotle is representing is sort of, emphasizing the realistic communication of you and a bunch of colors on a wall. And then the ideal is where that takes you. And I'd never really gotten that until right now. So I want to thank you because you've really sort of unlocked the painting for me in a way that it hadn't been before. It's wonderful.
Yeah, thanks. That's nicely put. And I do feel as if this, Raphael felt that very point very deeply. I mean, here he is trying to communicate this word outwardly through his own kind of painterly ways, but he is in conversation with some of these kind of more upward focused philosophers and trying to not see these things as in conflict, but rather as being potentially in harmony with each other. Yeah, it's really miraculous, all the kinds of things that Raphael is able to put into play in this.
Well, one of the things apparently he put into play is apparently a little piece that has the meaning of the universe on it. So I certainly can't get that out of that little segment. So, are you willing to give that a whirl?
Sure.
And for those who already know the meaning of the universe, it's okay. You don't need to listen, or if you want to cover your ears for a few minutes.
As many of you may know, I mean, Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans were associated with an idea that Aristotle attributes to them, that, in a sense, the universe is made out of numbers or harmony, ways in which numbers interact. And this tablet seems to be a kind of an expression of this idea. that says at the top in Greek, apogdoon. Here's the kind of attempt to lay it out as clearly as possible. This was originally drawn by the early art historian Balori, I believe maybe the one who gave the School of Athens its name too. But so what do we see here? Well, we see this word apogdoon, and then we see the numbers, Roman numerals 6, 8, 9, and 12, all connected to the others with various looping lines that contain some more Greek words here, diatessaron, diapente, and diapason. And then at the bottom, we have a little pyramid, a sequence of 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the number 10 at the bottom. Apogdoon is a technical term for the Pythagoreans on top of an eighth that refers to the mathematical process of adding a number to an eighth of itself. So the apogdoon of 8 is 9, because 8 plus 1/8 of itself, or 8 plus 1, is 9. Or if we do 16, another easy one, 16 plus 1/8 of itself, which is 2, 16 plus 2 equals 18. So the apogdoon of 16 is 18. It's said that Pythagoras hated the number 17 because it separated 16 from its apogdoon. Whereas the beauty of 8 and 9 is that they're natural numbers with nothing separating them from their apogdoon. So if we go back to our tablet here, we have a really interesting number sequence with 8 and 9 at the center of it. And then we have the 6 and the 12 flanking them. And these various relationships shown by the looping lines give us a set of musical ratios. So 9 to 8 is the major second, that's the apogdoon. And then if we look at 8 to 6 here, the diatessaron, this is the perfect fourth, and you can reduce 8 and 6 down to 4 to 3. And then you have 9 and 6 here, which is the perfect fifth, the diapente, which can be reduced down to 3 to 2. And then you have the octave, 12 to 6, which is the diapason, which can be reduced to 2 to 1. So what we have here is we have the ratio. So we have 9 to 8 in the center, and then around it, the ratios that give us 4, 3, 3, 2, 2, 1, which correspond to the 1, 2, 3, 4 at the bottom of the tablet. And the Pythagoreans believe that this, that this was how they tuned what they called the lyre of Hermes, and the tetrachord associated with it, G, C, D, G. So this corresponds to the four strings on the lyre, which they thought also corresponded to all the other fours that made up the universe, the 4 seasons, the 4 elements, the 4 phases of the moon. And then that tetractys at the bottom, the 1, 2, 3, 4, was meant to signify the organization of space. So 1 makes a point, 2 makes a line, 3 makes a plane, and 4 makes a tetrahedron in 3-dimensional space. So in a sense, you can construct the universe out of 1, 2, 3, 4, according to the Pythagoreans. And of course, 1, 2, 3, and 4 add up to 10, which is the base of the number system as well. So they believe that this kind of contained the architecture of the universe itself. And so Pythagoras was interested in trying to use this tetrachord in the project of kind of mapping the music of the spheres themselves all together. And so, you know, this Pythagoreanism was sometimes seen in the Renaissance as a kind of a key to the reconciliation of philosophy altogether, or the various philosophical theories. And Raphael seems to have, you know, kind of put it there as a little interesting note of what's going on. So, it's always kind of charming when there are these little mysteries encoded in the painting itself. So I don't know, maybe it's not the meaning of the universe, but at least it's one theory of how the universe can be constructed out of math and music.
The structure of the universe. Very cool. All right. Well, so yeah, I don't see. Okay, there we go. And I think we can all go unless there are any other final comments. No. So Allegra, do you have any information about the next talk, or do we know that?
I do not just yet, but I will keep everyone updated. So look out in your inbox for information on the next talk.
Yeah, this is great. So let me just speak for everyone else, Scott. I was just I'm very impressed, and I love this kind of stuff myself. I remember a professor of mine, John Fleming, wrote a book about Bellini's St. Francis in the Desert, and he did a whole book just interpreting that one painting, and it's still printed by Princeton University Press now, and it's just like, just the depth of interpretation you can get out of these things, or let's put it so that other people can get out of these things, always amazes me. I feel like I can follow along, but I can never actually generate it myself, and it's really exciting when someone can kind of lead me through like that. And I really encourage you to do more of it, because I would love to see you make a little volume of just 5 or 6 of these paintings or 10 of these paintings, and go through them like this. It's great, and I love the way it also affects our teaching. I know someone who had her doubts about this one other teacher who was very celebrated, because she said, I visited his classroom and I didn't see the students engaged. I didn't see that kind of life in the faces and in the bodies also that you're talking about here, and it's very visible in this painting when you're reminded to look for it. So glorious. Okay, thank you all very, very much. I'm gonna head on out to my closing, and yeah, thank you, Scott.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for coming.